I'm Tom Hoen. I'm at Imperial College, where I research on the area of IP, and I also teach a course called Business Models and IP, and I will rename it now Tarzan Economics, where the exam question last year was, explain the business model of Spotify. So it's fascinating, that area.
I'm David Aseki. I work here at Bournemouth University. I do decision-making. I study decision-making in organizations. So I have to say, I want to be upfront. I know very little about copyright. So I'm here to talk about experiments and experimental research and how it could possibly be applied to copyright research or law, probably in general.
My name is Joost Poort. I work with the Institute for Information Law, associated with the University of Amsterdam, and I work there as an economist. Well, first of all, thank you for the invitation to be present here.
One of the things that I find interesting about the discussions we've had today is the fact that it's really difficult to have discussions about evidence without actually having discussions about evidence-based policy. So we've actually discussed more the policy in many ways than the evidence.
First of all, let me say that I happen to agree with the IPO guidelines for good evidence. As you would expect from an academic, I find peer review perfectly normal, even though I don't necessarily always like it when it happens to me. But I do believe in that process, so I find nothing offensive about that.
Considering the IPO document, I have to start off with noticing that I endorse most of it, what's there. But also it's most of a holy grail what's presented there, saying, okay, peer review, data available, replicability, fantastic. But as was pointed out already, timelines or money often do not allow for peer review in the process, for research being published, peer reviewed in journals before the deadline of the consultation periods are over.
One is clarity of evidence. I think we need to distinguish between clarity of presentation and the fact that when we look at data, we often find data is messy. It's not very clear, it's difficult to interpret. Sometimes we have too much data and we have to look and test for various influences. Sometimes we have too little data. We still try to make some inferences.
Data don't lie, but people do. And that's a big problem. So we have to remember that when we're looking at data, the data shouldn't theoretically have any bias, but it's an interpretation that we can find a lot of bias.
I came across a very nice example quite recently. I did a survey on file sharing, amongst other things, and my finding was that file sharers are the largest customers of the industries, buying more music, streaming more music from legal sources, going to concerts more often. And the same result was found by Columbia University recently, and the journalist I came into contact with said, do you know this research? And the IFPI or the MPA reacted to the other research saying, well, 65% of file sharers never pay for downloading music. And he said, are they lying? How is that in your research? And I looked in my own data, and actually spot on, 65% of people who had downloaded from illegal sources in the last year had not paid for downloading music in the last year. But from the people who had not downloaded from illegal sources in the last year, 92% had not paid for downloading music. So they were presenting a fact, they were presenting evidence, but they were leaving out the important context to interpret this evidence.
Now, a little add-on is that the ultimate aim of transparency is usually to enable replication. And I understand how that wouldn't feature prominently in those guidelines for good evidence, because replication would be very exceptional. But I think that's a good measure of whether transparency really has been achieved.
Because one of the ways that we all use to try to get a better understanding of knowledge, of evidence as a surrogate of knowledge, is to be able to replicate whatever results in evidence. And now, experiments, I think, are one of the most powerful ways to replicate data, to gather evidence on a regular basis if certain conditions are met.
do like natural experiments, we like looking at history, we like looking at data that has been collected. But when it comes to design of policy instruments, we need to be very careful and think what is the expected impact. And some of these instruments are either new, untested, they can't be checked with respect to history, or the situation is a new one that we're faced with, new business models. So I encourage use of experiments.
If you want to conduct an experiment, you got to make sure that, let's say, there is a significant control, and the only thing that varies is the one that you want to study, because otherwise you don't get to information that's clean enough to make judgment or to create data or evidence.
I also believe that anecdotal and qualitative evidence should and has a strong role to play in providing evidence for copyright policy. I would argue that quantitative studies and qualitative studies should be clearly distinguished, however. Maybe it should be, those submitting evidence should be encouraged to really decide when they're doing what.
So what is good evidence? And I'll show my bias as an economist and say it's quantitative. But at the same time, as we've mentioned multiple times today, evidence in IP is really difficult to collect. And I would argue that some evidence is better than no evidence. I've done some work on business models and trade secrets. Both are notoriously difficult to measure. They're either secret or how on earth do you measure a business model? So in cases like that, and in a lot of cases, we need qualitative evidence to either complement or perhaps illuminate areas where we are simply not able to do so. So I think qualitative evidence has a very important role.
I am very skeptical about anecdotal evidence because it's quite often off the mark, and that's because this debate on piracy and copyright issues is a very polarized debate, and it's a very fierce debate, and people will hang on to anecdotes that are in favor of their way of seeing things.
So I wanted to sort of say overall we've got imperfect evidence, but we are moving towards having better evidence, and I think some evidence is better than none. And I'll go back to my dad again. He said that in medicine it takes 5 years to adopt a good idea and 20 years to get rid of a bad one. And I'd say that in copyright it seems to take us about a lifetime plus 70 years to get any idea.